These notes are about physical and chemical changes, and in particular some ways to tell if a substance has undergone a chemical change. So the question here are, what are some clues that provide evidence that a chemical change has taken place? So, to kind of understand the difference between a chemical change and a physical change, you need to kind of think about your physical properties, which you learned earlier in the year. These are properties that can be observed without changing the substance. Some examples are color, odor, luster, malleability, ductility, density, and they have some examples on the page. It says gold is a yellow, odorless, malleable, and ductile, and has luster. So those are several properties of gold. A diamond is clear, odorless, dull, and not malleable or ductile. And coal is black, dull, dirty, smelling, and not malleable or ductile. So this is just giving you a few examples of when you look at a substance, you kind of go through these physical properties, and when you're done with something, you check to see that they still have those physical properties. All right, the chemical properties are properties that you see when something is chemically happening. So these are properties that can be observed when the substance is changing into a new substance. Examples are flammable, combustible, corrosive, reactivity to acids and bases, or tarnishing. So there are some pictures on here that are showing some of those terms. If you don't know what they are, you can certainly look them up and get more information if you'd like. But the idea here is when these things are happening, any of these chemical properties, you end up with a new substance at the end of it. All right, so for a physical change, it involves a change in the appearance of matter. The change is in the size, shape, or state of matter, and no new substance is formed. The big question to ask yourself is, after the change, do you have something new? So if I boil water and it goes from being a liquid to a gas, is it still water? Well, yes, it's still water. It's just now gas water. We usually call it steam or water vapor, but it's still water. And I could collect that and condense it back down and make liquid water, okay, or have liquid water. Crushing a can. If I have a can and I crush it, it's still a can. It still has all of those physical properties that it had before. It just maybe a slightly different shape. And if you melt metal, so you have metal, you heat it up to a liquid, you melt it and get it into the shape that you want, and then you let it freeze or harden, you still have the metal and it still has all the properties that it had originally. So these are all examples of physical changes. The other side of this is a chemical change. It's a process by which a new substance is formed. The new substance will have different properties than the original substance. So the example I have here is if you paint your nails, you cannot unpaint them or take the nail polish off and reuse it. Okay, so once it hardens, it's done. It has different properties. It can't be painted on again. Okay. In the same extent, if you fry an egg, you cannot unfry an egg. The fried egg has different properties than just an egg. It has a different texture. It's now solid instead of liquid, and it has a different color, and even a little bit of a different taste if you eat a raw egg compared to a cooked egg. So the questions to ask yourself for a chemical change is, after you change it, do you have something new? Can you physically undo what you did? And if you can, if you have something new, then it's a chemical change. If you can undo what you did to it, then you know that's not a chemical change, okay? All right, so here are some clues that you had during class to show you that you might have a chemical change. Notice that I didn't say always, but just might. So the first one is a production of a gas. So if you end up with bubbles, there's a possibility that you have a chemical change, okay? You can produce a precipitate, and that's where you take like two liquids, you put them together, and you get a solid substance. That is an example of a chemical clue that can give you a chemical change. Change in color, like leaves changing color, or change in temperature, like when you use a hand warmer and you put them in your pocket and they get nice and warm. Over time, you know that you won't be able to continue to use it. It has kind of a lifespan, usually like 6 or 8 hours, sometimes 12. So each of these clues indicate a chemical change. Okay? Now, I will say this, if you put a pot of water and you heat it up on the stove and you're adding heat, okay, that is not a chemical change. Even though you're changing the temperature, your water is just getting warmer and you are providing the heat. That's a little different than when you have two chemicals and you put them together and they just produce heat on their own. So kind of have to think about each of these a little bit and get some ideas of when you know that you are going to have a chemical change and when you don't. All right, here are some other chemical clues. Production of light. Okay, so something like fireworks or a glow stick will produce light on its own, and so that's a chemical clue. Production of sound. Fireworks going off. Sometimes you hear a popping noise. Production of an odor. So sour milk. When you let milk set out and it goes sour, it gets a different odor. Disappearance of a substance. So if you have something and then it disappears. Now you have to be careful because dissolving, like when you take Kool-Aid mix and water, it disappears, but it's still there. But sometimes you have, like, for example, when your car rusts, that rust over time can like disappear and fall off because you've got that new substance and it's really crumbly. Okay, and you'll also see some examples of that in class where something disappears. Just because you see what you think is a clue, it might not be one. So water can boil and become a gas, but this is still water. It's a physical change. There you go. I hope that helps you get a little bit of a review of physical and chemical changes.